common question that I see VGC players ask is, when should I invest in defense instead of in HP? I have never seen this question get answered in a satisfactory way, so I've made this presentation to try to explain that. Some of the explanations I've seen are that defense will allow you to survive hits from physical and special attacks, or I've heard that for Pokemon that have low HP, you want to invest in HP, and for Pokemon that have low defenses, you want to invest in defenses, all of which are true, but I don't think that these are the full picture. So first, let's look at an example. This is an Incineroar versus a Corviknight. The Incineroar has no attack investment, so it has 135 attack, and you have 32 EV points to invest in the Corviknight. Now, you could invest all of your points into defense on the Corviknight, and that would mean it would take 62 to 73.9% damage from the Incineroar's Flare Blitz, and you'd be left with 45 to 65 HP remaining. You could also put all your points into HP, and you'd be left with 43 to 71 HP remaining, and you would take slightly more damage as a percentage of your HP, but you would be left with around the same, but potentially more HP remaining if you get a good roll, but then all of your points are in HP and you don't have any of your points in defenses. However, you could also invest all of your points in a way that reduces your percentage damage taken, which is often how you see people EV their Pokemon. So this was the best percentage damage that I could find for this damage calculation, where you take 61.3 to 74% damage from the Flare Blitz. And in this case, if you're splitting your EVs 16 in HP and 16 in defense, then you'd be taking this amount of damage and you'd be left with 49 to 73 HP remaining. So in this case, you would have significantly more HP remaining compared to if you put it all into defense, and then slightly more if you were putting it all into HP, and you still have points in defenses. The other option that you could have is you could set your defense at a very specific point at 143 defense, where you would take more damage as a percentage, but you would be left with more HP remaining. So in this case, you're investing less of your points into defense, meaning you have more of your points to put into HP, which gives you better overall bulk into special attacks as well. And you're left with 48 to 72 HP remaining. So you're getting a better return on your defense investment with this spread here, putting exactly 5 points into defense and the rest into HP, and you're getting better overall survivability, because if you put all of your points into defense, you would end up actually surviving the attack and taking less of a percentage of your health, but having less HP remaining, which is just worse. But if you put all your points into HP, you would still end up with less HP at the end of the day, and you would have worse overall defensive bulk. So you'd be taking more damage on the whole. This leads to the finding that for any given attack stat and move power, there's a defense point at which below that point, every point of defense will reduce damage by more than 1 HP, and above that threshold, every point of defense will reduce damage by less than 1 HP. If you're trying to build your Pokemon optimally so that you're investing your points and you're not wasting any of the points, you want to put your defenses at this threshold point, or you want to try your best to have it at the threshold point. This obviously applies to single attacks, because if you're going to take more than one attack, then you can have your defenses invested more highly, because even if each point of defense is reducing the damage, say by half of an HP, the fact that you're taking 2 hits means that your points of defenses are still being used. This doesn't take into account the fact that damage rolls and rounding happen in Pokemon. So this will actually significantly vary where the threshold is, but this doesn't affect the fact that there is a threshold at which it's no longer optimal to put points into defense, and your points should go into HP at that point. Let's take a step back and try to understand the damage formula for Pokemon. So the way that damage is calculated is based on this formula here, where it depends on the level of your Pokemon, the move's power, the Pokemon's attack, and the defender's defense. And then there are a lot of modifiers that can go into it, where some of them include the number of targets. So if you're doing a spread move, you have a modifier on that. If there's weather, there's a separate modifier. If there's a critical hit, there's a modifier. There's the random modifier where all of the values. There's the random modifier, that's any integer from 85 to 100. That's then divided by 100. So you can get a total of 16 different damage rolls. There's of course stab, there's type advantage, there's burn that affects the move's power and not the damage output. And then there's a bunch of other different modifiers. But if we want to simplify the damage formula, we can just say that damage is proportional to the move's power as well as the ratio of attack and defense. What this means is that since the Pokemon's attack is going to be static, if you're trying to calc to live certain attacks, so the only thing that you can change is defense. This means at lower defense values, if you're increasing your defense, it'll have a greater effect than if your defense is higher. So if you consider an example here, let's say your attack here is 100 and your defense is 1. Then if you increase your defense to 2, you'll be cutting that damage in half. If you increase your defense to 3, you'll be cutting that damage by a third. In a more realistic example, if the attack is 100 and the defense is, let's say, 50, and then you add 25 defense to that, then you're doing 100 over 75. But if your defense is already 100 and then you're increasing your defense to 125, then the damage goes from 100 over 100 to 100 over 125. So proportionally, the reduction in damage is much smaller when your damage is higher. I've graphed the damage reduction per stat point and in several examples here. So this is an example of a 120 base power neutral attack where there's various different attack stats that the attacker can have and various different defense stats that it can have. So the color changes from red to green where the damage reduction per stat is greater than 1. So that means at around this point here, at around 109, and then it reduces, your damage is going to get reduced by 1. And so if your defense is higher than that, then the damage is going to get reduced by less than 1. So it's no longer efficient to be putting points into defense if you're taking a 120 base power neutral attack. This is a little bit unrealistic. And if you're familiar at all with the damage stat, it's very rare to have a defense that is this low. So a more realistic example is a 120 base power stab attack. And these are probably more realistic defense values that you'll see. So it's in the range of 137 to 100 and something, where if your defense goes above this 137-ish point, then it's no longer worth it to put points into defense. But below that, it's still worth it because each point is reducing the damage taken by more than 1. And then if we increase the power again to a 120 base power super effective attack, then it's efficient to have points in defenses up until a way higher value at 158 for a 225 power move. So even at this value here, you're looking at it being efficient to put points into defense in the range of 120 to 160. So if you're planning on surviving super effective non-stab attacks, then you're looking at having a much higher defense point. This would also mean that if you're taking a 120 base power super effective stab attack, then the defense goes even higher. But at that point, then you're looking at defense values that are somewhat unrealistic to even have on a Pokemon. Now, one thing to consider as well is that defense can have modifiers in it as well as attack. So attack can have modifiers like stab and super effective, but defense can can be calculated with the modifier. So for example, if you have an assault vest, then each point of defense is increasing your defense stat by 1.5. And if you're in sandstorm or snow as a rock or ice type, the same would apply. Or if you're looking at Dondozo with commander, then each point of defense is increasing your defense by 2 points. What this means is that when you're trying to consider what defense you want to have, you also want to consider these modifiers, but it's not necessarily in an intuitive way. So if we look at this example again, this is the 120 base power super effective attack, where the defense that you want to have is 158-ish to 120 something. If you are looking at having an assault vest or having a EV light or having a 1.5 times defense boost from the weather, you would think that the defense that you would want to have would be in the range of 100 at most, because then it's going to bring you up to this point. However, the way that defenses are calculated is not very intuitive. And so the actual range of defense that you want to have is this range here of 100 to 130. So you actually want to have more defense than you would think in order to still optimally be reducing your damage by 1. So this means that if you're taking an attack from a 220 attack Pokemon that's 120 base power super effective, and you have a 1.5 times defense modifier, it's still efficient to be putting points in defenses up until this around 130 mark, because each point of defense that you're putting in is still reducing your damage by more than 1. It's not necessarily intuitive, like I said. So how do you find these defense values if you don't have these charts? What I have is a spreadsheet that calculates all these defense values depending on the move power, the attack, and the modifiers. I've shared this as a Google document. You can save it as a copy if you want to look at it yourself. But the way it works is you enter the move power, you enter your Pokemon's attack, you enter the modifiers to the attack and the modifiers to the defense. And then if you want to look at different rolls, if you want it to work for a max roll versus a min roll, you'd have to enter that as well. And then you'll see in this example, if you're taking an 80 power move like Dire Claw from a 189 attack Pokemon like Sneasler, and it's a stab move, the point at which you want to be for defense is around 100. So at around 100, each point of your defense is reducing damage by 1, and at less than 100, it's greater than 1, and at more than 100, it's less than 1. You can clearly get away with having your defense at around 90-ish, because you're really losing maybe 1 point of damage, 1 or 2 points of damage at that range. But as you go below that, the amount of damage reduction that you get per point increases really quickly. If you look at the graphs again, the graphs sort of accelerate with the amount of damage reduction that you're getting when you're at really low defenses. So if your defenses are really low, it's really worth it to put points into defense, versus if your defenses are near the threshold, it's close to, it becomes a lot less worth it, and you can really justify putting it somewhere else. In terms of general rules with defense thresholds, the numbers that I've found are at around 113 defense is where you want to be if you're taking just neutral stab attacks from strong Pokemon. Below and above that doesn't make a huge difference. The threshold is generally at around that 113 to 120 mark. If your defenses are really low, in the 85 or less range, then putting points into defenses and special defenses really help, because it will reduce damage by 2 or more. If you look at the examples again, for strong, super effective attacks, you're looking at when your defenses are incredibly low in the range of the 80s or the 70s or even the 90s. The amount of damage reduction is crazy. You're getting 3 or 2 or sometimes 4 points of damage reduction for each point of defense that you're putting in. So when your defenses are just really low, not even in the triple digits, it's really worth it to put points into defenses. And then what I've also found is above 140, your damage reduction is very rarely worth it. Even for super effective attacks, you're sometimes getting some damage reduction, but it's still really not that worth it. And certainly from neutral attacks, you're very rarely reducing damage by more than one. So if your defense is already at around 140 with no investment, there are a lot of good examples of this, but for example, Galarian Wheezing will have a base defense of 140 with no investment. It will not need more defense to take neutral attacks. You can invest all the rest of the points into HP. Now, as final thoughts here, obviously, these are general rules just to understand how defenses work. These are not recommendations for how to build your Pokemon necessarily. I just wanted to share this slideshow to talk about why points should go into defenses versus HP, because I've never seen this explained in this way. Obviously, you want to calc to live specific attacks before considering defense thresholds. For example, if you're using a Garchomp, you want to calc to live a Dragon Claw from another Garchomp without considering a defense threshold. But defense thresholds are a really helpful tool to understand where you want your defenses to be if you're trying to just survive a bunch of neutral hits, or if you're trying to just optimize your defenses in a way that lets you put as much into HP as you can while still being efficient with your defense points. Again, I've never seen it explained in this way, and I think that this is a useful way to understand what defense points do versus what HP points do. Like I said before, if you're surviving more than one attack, your defenses can be prioritized over your HP, including if you're above the threshold, because if you're reducing your damage by 0.5 to 0.8 per point of defense, but you're taking 2 or 3 attacks, then your defense reduction is going to be greater than 1 HP. So having a point in defense is going to be more valuable than having a single HP. HP also provides the additional utility of surviving against both physical and special attacks. So the conventional wisdom of putting all your points into HP for bulk is often right, because you want that general survivability against all kinds of attacks. But if you're trying to specifically target certain attacks, or if you naturally have already high defense in one of the stats, but somewhat lower defenses in the other one, then you might want to consider putting your defense points into the lower stat if you're trying to reach a threshold for some neutral damage. In particular, in draft leagues, I found defense thresholds to be incredibly useful because you know the small number of Pokemon that you're going to face. So you can calc to hit the defense threshold against their specific possible attacks, and then put the rest of your points into bulk, or put the rest of your points into attack. It helps you be really efficient with your points, and it's helped me survive a lot of attacks that I really don't know if I had any business surviving. But for general VGC, defense thresholds are still just a useful way to understand how the damage calculation formula works. Thanks for your time.